My name is Jason Dablow. I'm with Trend Micro. I'm a field engineer specializing in cloud security. I'm joined by a number of my colleagues, Chuck, David, and Yvonne from Trend Micro, as well as Alan from Snyk also. So ultimately, I'll be guiding kind of this workshop, but ultimately anyone else listed here can also help if we get stuck or run into any issues, or if you have questions. As just Jim mentioned, just throw them into the chat. We'd be happy to take a look, and if we need to kind of dive in further with, remote desktop or break in further, certainly, we can do that as well while we're kind of breaking out into little groups and going through the lab exercises as well. So for this overview, we're really focusing on a few key takeaways that we'd like you to just bring away from this. And ultimately, those are around the open source risks that are out there. It is I'll call it a widely used technique out there when you're developing applications and using open source. We'll talk a little bit of what that means in terms of open source, trying to understand the importance of it, how to test your own repositories. We're going to look at the bill of materials or open source licenses as well. And then also dig into some of the vulnerabilities that might exist within open source as well. Throughout today, we're going to be using a sample application. It's a Java Goof app that was developed with Snyk and Trend together. And in the chat, there is a link to the PDF workbook, which has kind of all the steps that I'm going to be going through with the slides. So I'll say the format is I'll present some slides, talk to you about what you'll be doing in the lab, and then ultimately following along with the workbook on trying to accomplish those, again, within your own test environment as well. So go ahead and click on that PDF workbook. That'll get you started and will ultimately allow you to follow along during those lab exercises that are coming up. We do have a number of prizes to give away throughout this workshop as well. So we have some trivia questions that I'll be asking in just a few minutes as part of this initial presentation, as well as a couple towards the end to kind of spread out the labs as well. I'll say a couple of them are paying attention questions, and a couple are specific to trivia as well. So make sure to listen and as well as put your thinking cap on as well. We'll be accepting the answers in the chat, the first one with the Amazon gift card. And then at the end, we'll have a lab exercise to win one of our 5 grand prizes as well. With that, let's just kind of take a quick view and glance on kind of the platform that we'll be working with today called Cloud One. It is a security service platform that's specifically focused on what builders are building in a cloud environment and really focused on 3 main use cases that you see along the outside. So whether it's going through a cloud migration and moving infrastructure up into a cloud environment, or perhaps your teams are starting to build within cloud native resources with cloud native applications, or even developing CCOE or Center of Cloud Excellence or Cloud Operational Excellence programs within your organization. We're really trying to fit and meet those 3 use cases when it comes to building out this security service platform. So whether you're a developer looking to include applications directly in a runtime environment using something like our Cloud One application security, or perhaps you're a DevOps engineer looking to introduce storage scanning capabilities within your application workflows within, say, AWS S3 or Azure blob storage, you'll have the ability to do that with our Cloud One file storage security. Or perhaps you're a DevOps engineer doing infrastructure as code building and want to scan stuff against misconfigurations using the Cloud One conformity. Those are just some of the services that we're offering as part of this platform. And if you've a regular attendee of NADOG, I'm sure you've heard these lightning pitches before that's going through a number of these solutions. But today we're going to be focusing on the newest service of Cloud One, the Cloud One Open Source Security by Snyk. This will be the basis of this entire workshop. We're going to be focused on learning about open source security together, finding those vulnerabilities and license issues that might be a part of that sample application that I was talking about earlier, and ultimately getting some hands-on experience with what this might look like within your own environment as well. So let's go and maybe just level set in terms of open source code, what this looks like within different environments. We know from Snyk's open source security paper, the State of Open Source Security report, that 80% of application code that's in use is actually open source. And open source just means, you're free to use it. And by free, it's essentially just freedom, not the, free from, the payment, but the freedom to use that. So all of the code is actually published out there. And when you make changes to the open source code, you also have to publish the changes that you make as well as part of that open source project. And also from Gartner, we know that 90% of IT organizations are actually using open source as well. So you have this huge amount of organizations that are doing software development and using open source because it's really the quickest way to get their application deployed. Why reinvent the wheel for something that you can just pull in from an open source library, so you don't have to actually rewrite some of that code base as well. The other thing we've seen that through our partnership with Snyk is also that 250% growth in open source vulnerabilities just in that last 3 years as well. So while the usage is growing, also the vulnerabilities that are associated or introduced as part of open source is also growing exponentially as well. And that takes us to our first trivia. So I'll give you just a quick minute, open up those chat windows. You're going to be presented with a few options. First one to get it will have be entered into that Amazon gift card.
Hey, when you open your chat, to make sure you're responding to everyone, otherwise we won't see it.
And so here we go. According to Open Source Security Report 2020, % of application code is open source. Got lots of entries in there. Looks like first and foremost, the answer is B, 80%. So congratulations, Joshua. Yvonne will be reaching out to you to get that information there. So awesome. So I will have a few more gift cards, so keep that participation coming. That's awesome. Thank you guys so much. So with that, the vulnerabilities reported versus the projects impacted. We have a number of vulnerabilities here on the left-hand scale. I want to say it's the Y scale, but I always screw up. I was terrible at whether that was algebra or geometry or whichever one it was. But you have the X-axis and the Y-axis for the number of vulnerabilities that's at the column on the left-hand side across the number of projects impacted on the right. So you can see something like prototype pollution that causes a lot of noise in different prototypes. That would be, say, a very broad range in terms of the number of projects that were impacted, but actually the number of vulnerabilities that are that particular type is actually quite low. On the flip side, something like XSS, which is cross-site scripting, represents a vast number of vulnerabilities. If people follow the OAuth Top 10, which is a reporter of the top 10 vulnerabilities within web applications, you'll know that the cross-site scripting has been there every single year that report has come out for 10 plus years. So really interesting in terms of the number of vulnerabilities that are reported across the different types as well. So, in 2019, you have, say, this popular NPM library, Lodash, used by over 4 million projects with 40,000 GitHub stars, and been downloaded over 80 million times. Had this kind of broad range in the vulnerabilities that it introduced in terms of a broad number of projects that were impacted as well. And then, of course, a lot of these are introduced by indirect dependencies or transitive dependencies as well. So these are really important to pinpoint very quickly within your environment because they're not necessarily brought in at that top layer, but brought down several layers down as well. And I purposely threw out like 4 numbers right at the end, so you wouldn't know which ones was which. What percentage of vulnerabilities occur in transitive dependencies? And looks like Yvonne has some work to do with checking the timestamps, because the answer was the same, B, 78%. So if you just, Yvonne, if you highlight, it looks like it was
So
Michael
I'm looking
Mugo.
at the 415 timestamp, and I see Michael Mugo.
Yep. That's who I had as well. Yvonne will be reaching out for that gift card.
Sounds good.
So And again, we'll dive into this on the hands-on workshops as well, is going through kind of looking at the dependency tree and how to actually look at transitive dependencies that are brought into an open source platform as well. So what we're really trying to do with the open source security is process that gap as security shifts left. Security teams, and again, this is what really we're focused on, right? So adding a visibility into security operations teams so they're well aware of not just what application teams are working on or what DevOps teams are deploying, but also get insights and priority of that, what's happening within open source specifically, what vulnerabilities are coming down the chain that might reach our runtime states. So you can prioritize these together. What we've seen as a security industry as a whole is lots of friction between security teams and DevOps or development teams. And that security teams are waiting until runtime to say, bring up that list of demands like, hey, you deployed this stuff without these security controls. But ultimately, as security is moving more left, or say moving top to down, if you will, in terms of that infinity loop of DevOps cycles, it's really important to increase the feedback loop of security into these DevOps teams as well. So ultimately, the open source security by Snyk is focused on visibility for security operations teams specifically. This might be a security team that's inside of a DevOps team. So if you're DevSecOps personnel as well, perfect for you in terms of this workshop. You'll also get tons of information as just a member of a DevOps team in terms of how to actually get and increase that visibility for security into the processes and app flows that you might be doing today as well. So the idea here, again, bringing continuous monitoring of vulnerabilities into a security-focused view. We want to prioritize those risks and recommendations and increase the collaboration of SecOps with DevOps to bring together and release that friction that might be building between these two teams as well. And again, we're really focused here on three problems. So problem one, security team cannot see vulnerabilities or license risks until they move and get a view into a developer landscape. Security teams struggle to track, prioritize open source risk because they don't have that visibility into code repositories. And it helps them prioritize those risks as well. And ultimately, we want to improve the build's runtime security of applications through collaboration with development teams. So we know exactly from a security perspective what might reach our runtime, that we can also add in place runtime capabilities to actually circumvent those vulnerabilities while development teams are fixing them as well. So again, it's all about increasing the agility of security teams, increasing the feedback loops into dev teams with security intelligence, and ultimately bringing those two teams together in a more collaborative sense. And here's really just kind of an overview of the hardware, of the architecture before we dive in and begin this workshop with all of the hands-on information. So we're connecting the Cloud One platform to Snyk specifically, so a Snyk integration directly within Cloud One. And then from there, we're doing scanning of a number of CI/CD tools, whether it's a Git repository or say an integration with Jenkins, to aggregate the data and give that visibility into vulnerabilities, into license reporting, and being able to scan, apply license policy, tag projects, again, get that reporting visibility that security teams so desperately need within these environments. All right, the last of the trivia before we jump into our hands-on labs. And this is an actual trivia question. So various studies, what percentage of applications contain open source vulnerabilities? Got some answers coming in here. The answer being 60 to 70%. So a number of the studies out there are saying that applications, what percentage contain open source vulnerabilities? 60 to 70%.
Looks
So
like
again,
our winner is Gabor Liptak. I hope I didn't butcher your name, but I'll be messaging you to get a good email from you.
Awesome. Thank you, Yvonne, and congratulations. And so we'll have one more after we kind of do a couple of these labs. So let's get started. Again, in the chat, David, if you could just paste it one more time, we'll have the link to a PDF that has all of the step-by-steps so you can really follow along at your own pace. The way this will go is I'll kind of walk through some of the steps on how to get you going within a lab environment, what to look for, what to look at, what's interesting, what might be more interesting to you. And then ultimately, it's all defined within the PDF as well. So in that first link there, that SharePoint link has the link to the PDF. So I'll go through some of the steps, and then we'll break for, say, 10 minutes to give you some time to ultimately click through that PDF, go through it on your own, get this hands-on experience as well. So first and foremost, what we're going to do is create a Cloud One account. You're going to go to cloud1.trendmicro.com. And that'll bring you up on the right-hand side. There is a button that says if you don't have a sign-in, that says sign up for a free trial. Just need to add your name, company account, email address. It'll send you a verification email. At which point, once verified, we'll click on the Open Source Security by Snyk tile, which just brings us directly into Snyk as well. I did prep our backend team, so this is letting them know that all of you fine folks are rushing in to do their sign up of Cloud One. And thank you, Yvonne. In the chat, there's also a clickable link if you would like, cloud1.trendmicro.com. So just a couple of minutes. Once it's complete, and you're able to sign up, go ahead and just give a quick acknowledgement in the chat if you would. And Deborah, if you brought you back to the original page, try going to the /trial directly. That'll give you directly to the sign up. Give everybody a couple of minutes. Again, if it goes back to the original page, if you just put cloud1.trendmicro.com/trial, that second link there, it should bring you directly to the creation of your account. And if anyone has successfully created their account, if you could just please just drop a quick acknowledgement into the chat. Great, so we have a couple of people that have created it, perfect. So in the interest of time, I'm just gonna go through just a couple quick integrations that we're going to create here. And again, looks like some more acknowledgements pouring in, that's great. Glad the signups are working as they should. So with that, once you sign into your Cloud One account and click on the Open Source Security tile by Snyk, you're going to be brought to an Integrations tab, at which point we're going to create a sample integration. So what you'll do is you'll click on Integration, Source Control, GitHub, and we will select a GitHub repository access, select without permissions, enter this GitHub URL, which we'll put into the chat so you have it also. Also, it is listed in the PDF. So again, I believe it starts on page 8 of the PDF if you want to add that. You can also, if you're, I would say, a power user with your own GitHub account already, you can go that route and just fork this project. But ultimately, for people that don't have a GitHub, it's the easiest way without a GitHub account. Click on the repository button, projects, reveal the Java Goof Trend project, which will also start that first scan of it as well. And thank you, Chuck. That GitHub project is there if you want to have a clickable link or a copy and paste link. That's perfect. So I'll give you guys just a couple minutes to just go through this, create the sample integration before you proceed to looking at some of the vulnerabilities that were brought in with this sample application as well. Again, this is a direct integration between Cloud One and Snyk, and then pulling in these repos directly through GitHub for this sample integration of this sample application that we have to really have I'll call it a baseline view of some vulnerabilities of open source licenses so we can walk through the rest of these workshop items. Yes, I was just going over the Git-based integrations here, specifically all of the popular Git-based products, so GitHub, GitHub Enterprise, all of the different specific Git repos that are out there are providing specifically the solutions for a way to discover a bulk of the applications. Because we're focused on security engineers specifically, it's the easiest way to bring in a bulk of the applications. And ultimately, we don't have to worry about, say, refreshing the screen as when developers make changes within the environment, they'll automatically start showing in terms of the license or vulnerabilities and things like that as well. So maybe just if everyone is done with the integration, maybe just a quick acknowledgement in the chat, or if you would like just another minute or two, certainly happy to wait. Awesome. Thank you, David. Again, that PDF document, if you want to follow along on your own time, certainly available there as well. And thank you, David. Appreciate the confirmation. Wait for just a couple other confirmations, making sure that people have set up this first integration within their environment. Perfect. So let's go ahead and start talking about lab module number 2, where we'll be discussing and showing the different projects, the vulnerabilities and dependencies that are in there, as well as getting visibility into all of this dependency trees information as well. So what we'll do is we'll start on PDF page 9 with these particular lab modules. So on lab 9, you'll have essentially page 9, you'll have the ability to start looking at
You went on mute, Jason.
Sorry about that. My phone dropped my call. Let me just call back. Unless you guys can hear me okay here.
It's a little bit tinny, but we can hear you.
Let me dial back in. Let me dial back in 1 second.
all right, that's always exciting. Dial in because you feel like it's more reliable, and then my phone drops the call. Okay, Jim, I see you smiling. Just you can hear me. Just a quick thumbs up.
Yeah, we got you.
All right, thank you. All right, so we'll start by understanding what a project is. Again, follow along on the PDF page 9. What we'll do is start looking and understanding a project using the open source security solution. So ultimately, all of the information is organized based on projects. And a project is listing all the open source components that a developer might be using within an application. So the components are open source components tested by Cloud One Open Source Security. Is really looking specifically at those open source libraries for vulnerabilities and license risks, and then giving you that visibility of what's happening within a particular environment. So in the last, in the Getting Started lab, we've essentially added this project to making sure that we get visibility into this Java Goof trend application and the open source libraries associated with it. And then ultimately what happens is when a developer creates an application, they list the direct dependencies needed for an application to work, and those dependencies have their own indirect dependencies. And so each one, for example, say you are bringing in, say, a dependency for your application, like it needed Apache. But Apache also has additional dependencies that it needs to run as well, and that's what represents the indirect dependencies within a particular environment. So what we'll be doing in terms of this lab number 2 is further understanding a project and seeing the different issues that are detected with it, and ultimately seeing the different package managers for a particular project and giving visibility into the, again, the open source licensing and the vulnerabilities, those threats, those different issues that might be presenting themselves as part of the open source strategy of an application as well. So as we're adding this project into open source security, we're seeing a number of different things within an environment. So whether it's the issues, whether it's a vulnerability or, again, that open source license, we're seeing different categories, issues, as well as a priority score that's relative to that issue that you're looking at. So within your own workshop, if you do click on, say, the pom.xml, you'll begin seeing different information that's presented as part of this open source project. So we see things like the user and system defined metadata. We have different tabs where we can look specifically at filters and dependencies. And each one of the vulnerabilities that you see as well would have a CVSS score also. This CVSS score gives it a priority rank in terms of, or excuse me, a severity rank in terms of that particular vulnerability, which we'll be discussing shortly as well. You have on the left-hand side a number of things like the filter issues, and you also have the issue card in the middle with additional details on that particular issue as well. So while this gives a nice view of what's going on within a particular environment, we might want to also use our filters to look specifically for things that you might be interested in as well. So for this first tab, we'll look specifically for code injection issues, focused entirely on web exploit 94. So if we type in the CWE-94, we'll now bring up a list of all the vulnerabilities that have that particular vulnerability within it as well. And if we want to say, look at only things that are mature for the exploit maturity, we now have that ability to do so also. And what we mean by exploit maturity is there an exploit out there for this particular vulnerability? So if there's a vulnerability out there, but there's no exploits for it, then maybe it's not so high on the severity. But if the exploit is out there that's very mature, it's likely in the hands of many people that might be exploiting that vulnerability. Might be interesting to note as well when you're talking about vulnerabilities versus exploits, is vulnerability is just a hole that someone could enter. Think of it as a way that an application is going to run that's not in its intended way. That introduces a vulnerability where something could happen under that hole or vulnerability. But an exploit is actually taking advantage of that hole in the system and then performing some malicious activity. And this is where we come up with the exploit versus the vulnerability, I'll call it language within security. Vulnerabilities, again, just that hole within the application itself, where the exploit is actually taking advantage of that hole or code to do so. So we have a number of also the, to continue on, we can also look at, say, the proof of concept for the exploit maturity. Now we can see things that are in a proof of concept stage when it comes to exploits. And this just means that a security researcher has created some, an exploit that could be used to extract information from this vulnerability or gain some additional access. It's just essentially an idea of an exploit that could be used in an environment, but it doesn't mean that there's specific code to do so. So there's the difference between the proof of concept and mature in terms of that exploit level. Excuse me. So the proof of concept would be lower down in your severity because while there is, say, proof of concept code out there to take advantage of it, there is an actual code that's available to do so. So now we'll click through some of the environment, look at front end, external, because now we're getting into the meat of the visibility that we want to prioritize. If something has, say, an exploit for it, and it's also externally facing where anyone can access it, you now have of something that could be exploited or exploitable by any number of threat actors that are out there. So the next steps that it's going to take you through is making sure that we look specifically at the different business criticality as well as that life cycle stage as well. And finally, we're going to narrow our focus even further to making sure that out of the hundreds of projects that are out there, we want to look for a single enterprise application. And this is what we'll do in these next steps for these combining of these filters, is really zeroing in on that visibility for a particular protection application that can be used or could be delivered in a runtime state within your environment that could expose immediately a vulnerability that is a problem or that needed to be triaged by either DevOps teams or security teams with runtime capabilities as well. So as we're going through this, you'll also have a link to the Snyk Intel database. So this Intel database allows you to essentially click on any of these vulnerabilities to get additional information about the different scoring as well. So, we talked about just from a high level, something like the CVSS, which is a score with a severity. It's also a intelligence database that relates to all of the publicly available vulnerabilities that are out there. So there's a number of different ones out there, and they all use this score and related information to kind of give a baseline on how a severity and how a vulnerability should be handled as it relates to different projects that are out there. So something like whether it's a vulnerability or a web exploit, if it's been disclosed or not, when it was actually published. And this gives the Snyk database a descriptive overview with specific remediation advice, references, and other relevant information as well. So inside these card details, you'll get an additional information on all of this CVSS information on this vulnerability, so you can begin to prioritize which one should take advantage first within a particular environment. So here you'll see just screen grabs of the CVSS scoring with all of the details. You'll have your vulnerability details with the remediation advice. And then just clicking back to the browser will bring you back to the original tile as well. Ultimately, what we'll see as well through this workshop is a dependency tree view, which gives great visibility into all of those indirect or transitive dependencies within the environment, to making sure that, yes, we might need a specific library to be brought in, but part of the dependencies of that library also has other dependencies as well. I remember at RSA last year, I actually stopped by the Snyk booth, and it was presented within the Trend Micro booth as well, in that showing that there was 10 lines of code within a sample application, but ultimately after all of the dependencies were brought in, it actually represented.
We lost you again, Jason.
His phone just dropped, so he's getting reconnected.
Yep. All right, sorry about that, everybody. I don't think I ever had a phone call drop when I was on a landline.
Wow, this is amazing. The demo gods are really out to get me today. 2 mobile drop phones in one meeting. Wow. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I'm getting flashes on my laptop that my internet's unstable and my mobile phone is dropping. So I don't think I can win on either front. So ultimately, hope we can get you through these last little workshop items. So the dependency tree we were talking about, I'm not sure how much of that story you caught, but Snyk was presenting in the Trend Micro booth at RSA last year, talking about a project that an application that had 50 lines of code with different dependencies. After all of the indirect dependencies were brought in, it represented over 100,000 lines of code. So these things are what can happen within a particular environment, where finding not just the direct dependencies, but all of the indirect dependencies of those are brought in as well, and finding the associated vulnerabilities within them is really, really impactful and important for different teams to have those views within an environment. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the license issues, which also is shown within the dependency tree also. So all of these indirect dependencies can also be viewed from an open source licensing perspective. And you can also add, say, different policy engagements for the licenses that could be in use within an environment as well. So you can get quickly notified that open source license is being used within the environment, and making sure that you're following those the license instructions as needed as well. So we'll go through some of those as well in terms of clicking on the settings, editing the GitHub settings. For this particular workshop, we're not going to say make these changes, but you have the ability to do so within the open source by Snyk environment. And ultimately with that, we'll give just a minute or so in terms of following along with the PDF. We are, I would say, a little bit behind, so I'll just give maybe just a couple minutes before we kind of dive into this trivia question and ultimately proceed to the last reporting issue with the open source licenses as well. So again, PDF is there in the chat if you need to follow along. We started on 9 and it goes through, I believe, slide 13, maybe more. I think more, but I'll have that for, I believe it's slide 18 actually. All right, so in the interest of time, because you're free to use this PDF and go through these instructions on your own, but I want to make sure that we stop at a, we only have an hour here to get through. We'll start with just this trivia and then proceed into the last lab of the day, and just kind of reviewing some of the reporting and open source licensing as well. So how many services does the Trend Micro's Cloud One platform offer? Answer in the chat. All right, I see a right answer there. I think we tried to fool you and not have the answer D this time. But 7 services across the Cloud One platform. Good job, Martin. Looks like you're in the winning for another Amazon gift card. Yvonne will be reaching out shortly as well. So we'll finish up with the reporting and open source licensing on page 18 of the PDF. Again, you'll have access to all this stuff after as well, so you can go through all these at your own pace. I know I'm talking a bit micro machines, hopefully not that fast and still able to be understood a little bit. If you're an 80s kid like I am, you understand the micro machines reference and the guy that was the fastest talker Guinness Book of Records at the time. And he was on the micro machines commercials for a little bit as well. So in this lab, we're going to go through some of the reporting capabilities by clicking on the reports tab. Again, this is focused in on getting information to ultimately again, we're focused on security teams here. So getting the visibility that security teams need in terms of the reporting capabilities that these open source issues are bringing into their pipelines. So we'll take a look at the summary tab. So this provides that visibility for security issues based on, the different values that we went over. You also have things like the exposure windows, which shows how long this application has been out there with these particular vulnerabilities. And if, the development teams or DevOps teams are, lowering your risk value by ultimately solving some of these problems within the code tree. But it gives that kind of timeline on the window of exposure that your organization is kind of vulnerable to based on the different issues that are found, and again, based on the different open source libraries that have been brought into a different project also. So if we look at, say, the Issues tab within the reporting by clicking on that projects filter for the pom.xml, we're now looking at, say, the vulnerability and license discrepancies, particularly for your package manager as well. So the issues can then be grouped or ungrouped based on your required views on what you're really focusing in on. I know a number of my customers were really interested in kind of the license discrepancies on their projects because it kind of gives them the idea of what's going on within the environment. And I had others like SOC teams, that the Security Operations Center engineers that are responsible for actually providing incident response and remediation. They were really interested on the vulnerabilities that were deployed into runtime so they can solve some of these through runtime controls as well. So from this, we have a filtered list that we can use to say specifically look at maybe at the arbitrary file write system with a archive extraction. So this is the zip-slip vulnerability, and we want to look at every open source package that has this particular issue with it. And we can then further click on the Dependencies tab and look specifically when that was brought in as well. So, I mentioned earlier on that, your direct versus indirect dependencies, you have that ability to see when this was brought in, as well as gives a clear view on how to actually fix this in terms of bringing in the correct problem or the correct dependency in terms of correcting that version or value that was brought in. So here we can look at the reporting and then also switch over to a licensing view and do that license tab as it relates to the open source licensing within a particular environment. So here we can do things like search for individual open source licenses. We can look at, say, specific license filters, as well as export specific issue data as a CSV as well. And that concludes the lab number 3 for our reporting. I'll give just a quick couple minutes to go through on your own time with that PDF document or following along through these ones here to get a quick view on the dependency tabs as it relates through reporting as well. And then I'll leave just a couple minutes to do that. And then stay tuned, and I will present the last optional lab, which you can do at your own time, which will give you a chance to win that smart doorbell that was offered earlier. So 2 minutes, click through the reporting, take a look at the dependency tab, click over to the license structure to view the open source licenses in use, as well as the dependencies there as well. And then in just a couple of minutes, I will show off the optional lab, which you can do to possibly win that smart doorbell. Again, the team here is standing by. If you have questions, feel free to toss them into the chat. Let's see the vulnerabilities tab under the issues. We also have an overview of both the vulnerabilities within the summary tab as well. Both the vulnerabilities, the security issues, as well as the license issues. All right, going to proceed because we just have a few minutes left, just to kind of talk about the optional lab to win the Nest Smart Doorbell. So this is a timed participation. We have it open to the first 4 that present and complete this, first 5 that complete this final lab. What you're going to do is connect your own repo and be one of the first 5 to send this screenshot. So under your projects, send that project of a repo that you brought in to Yvonne_Balderas at trendmicro.com. We will put that in the chat. She just did. Perfect. So connect your own repo, be one of the first 5 to send the screenshot of your projects of your Cloud One with that information to Yvonne. And we will send out that Nest Smart Wi-Fi Doorbell to you if you're one of the first 5. And with that, I just wanted to share the survey. This is the first workshop of the kind that we've done. We always would appreciate the feedback in terms of things that you found particularly useful as part of this workshop or things that didn't work well for you. So ultimately with that survey QR code on the right here, or we'll paste the survey link within the chat as well. If we could get your feedback in terms of things that you liked about this workshop, we can continue to make it better and more valuable for other participants that do this in the future as well. I also wanted to take this time to thank Jim and the rest of the NADOG community and for everyone that joined us for your participation today. You do have access to the Cloud One open source security by Snyk for the next 30 days when you've created your account. You have access also to that PDF, which goes through all of the things that I talked about today in terms of finding those vulnerabilities within your open source projects, as well as giving visibility and management for those open source licenses as well. So you can continue to use that with the PDF and the sample application, or even continue to do so within your own repos as well. And then of course, the entire Trend team here, as well as myself, is always happy to help if you want to look at more information within your own environment. Certainly can do that as well, if you're interested also. And with that, we're reaching the top of the hour. Again, thank you so much, Jim, and thank you so much to the NADOG community for allowing us to present this workshop to the NADOG community. Always great to hear what people are doing in terms of the feedback, and then looking forward to the next DevOps and Hops, and hopefully having a beer with all of you real soon.